Welcome to Shift, a college admissions ACT, SAT, and CLT podcast for a changing world. I'm Tyler, the founder of Achievable, and we have an affordable ACT course that includes everything you need to ace your ACT. A full textbook, tons of questions backed by our memory-enhancing algorithm, videos on key topics, a built-in study planner, and full-length practice exams. You can get a free trial by going to achievable.me, and if you like it, use the code podcast to get 10% off at checkout. Now, let's get started. Today we have Phil Black from PrepWell Academy joining us. And Phil, I'd love if you can introduce yourself and your company to the audience.
Yeah, thank you, Tyler. The company is called PrepWell Academy, and it's been 20 years in the making. I have a relatively varied background, which hopefully adds to the value that I bring to some of the students that I work with. I've worked on Wall Street, been in the military, gone to business school, been an entrepreneur, been on Shark Tank twice, and recently, the last 10 or 12 years, started working in college admissions, where I've worked with students who are interested in high academic, highly selective colleges, students who are athletes and want athletic scholarships, and people who are interested in the military with ROTC and service academies. And PrepWell Academy has born out of the immense interest in this third post, which is the military scene with ROTC scholarships
Mhm.
and service academy appointments.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what we're going to be talking about today is ROTC, right? And it's something that I actually don't know that much about. I had a couple friends in college who were in ROTC, but I really would love just for my own sake and for our audience's sake, if you could kind of take it from the top, right? So let's start with the basics. What is ROTC?
Sure, and you're not alone, Tyler. I was in the military and I barely knew what ROTC was. Some of the audience might recognize it as being termed ROTC. It's another colloquial term for ROTC. ROTC technically stands for Reserve Officer Training Corps. And my guess is
Mhm.
that there's a large number of people in the listening audience right now who have never heard of it, or maybe they've heard of it, but when you press them on what it is, they have a hard time articulating it. It's just this
Mhm.
nebulous idea that they have in their mind. So, I'll be interested to see how this works out and how people resonate with the message here. ROTC represents one of three different pathways that a person or a student can take to become a military officer in the Army, the Navy, or the Air Force. The two other ways
Mhm.
are number one, going to a service academy. People might recognize the Naval Academy, Air Force Academy, West Point, the Coast Guard Academy, and the Merchant Marine Academy. Those are the five military service academies. So that's one way. The second way is through OCS, Officer Candidate School. That's a little bit different. That's
Mhm.
if you already have a 4-year college degree, you can go to an accelerated program and become a military officer after the fact. Or ROTC, which is a hybrid of the two. ROTC is basically a program that you participate in while you're in college. It's mostly
Mhm.
part-time. It's often on scholarship, and we could talk about that more. And it prepares
Mhm.
students as military leaders to lead enlisted sailors, soldiers, airmen, and Marines once they graduate in the Army, the Navy,
Mhm.
the Air Force, or the Marines.
Yeah, and I guess that's sort of the first question I have is really like, who are the people that do the ROTC? Like, are these people that are going to be that basically they've got their heart set on a military career, but they want to go to college first? Is this a way that people will, basically serve in the military, kind of go through this program, and then after college is over and, ROTC, they'd be doing it to help with the scholarship aspect. They like then quit and like go live a civilian life? Like, what sort of is the typical profile of people that do this?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. And let me back up a second. And please, Tyler, call me out if I start using military jargon or acronyms, because I know I get
Hmm.
frustrated if there's somebody who's a quote subject matter expert and they start talking about things and it goes over people's heads. So I'm going to try to be very diligent about not streaming into military jargon. So let me back up even a little bit more. Do people out there, and I know in my conversations with people all the time, they sometimes don't even know what the difference between an officer is and an enlisted person in the military. So most of the
Yeah, I mean,
military,
I would say. That's a good thing to define here.
Yeah. I mean, most people in the military, I'm not sure the exact stat, I'm sure it varies by branch, but most of the people in the military are enlisted, meaning they haven't necessarily gone to college. They don't particularly have a leadership
Mhm,
role, but they're the worker bees. They're the people who work on the ships, they work
mhm,
on the aircraft, they work on the trucks and all the equipment and the logistics and the support. So there's a big group of enlisted personnel. Some of them have college degrees, but they've chosen not to take the quote unquote leadership or the officer track. The officer track is
mhm,
for people who have 4-year degrees and they take one of these three different paths to become military leaders or military officers. We call them commissioned officers. So it's maybe roughly 10%, 15%. I'm not exactly sure the number, but it's a smaller percent because obviously in the hierarchy, there has to be fewer leaders than there are worker bees. So the idea here
mhm,
for people who are interested in ROTC or the service academies or OCS, as you suggest, is maybe they want to make the military a career, but they don't have to. There's an option to go into do an ROTC program and quote unquote fulfill your service commitment, which is the time that you have to
mhm,
serve as a military officer to essentially pay back for what could be a free education or a near free education. You're quote unquote paying that back with a commitment to serve as a military officer for 4 years, 5 years, sometimes longer. If you have a very specific community that you're involved in, aviation or special operations where there's a lot of training, sometimes that minimum commitment of 5 years gets bumped a little bit just because there's so much
mhm,
training up front that they want to make sure that they get their money's worth out of the officer once they finish all their training. But you asked who is ROTC for? What type of student might
mhm,
gravitate toward this? So I would say number one, students who are well-rounded, an all-American type of kid. I know that doesn't seem like it's something that's in vogue these days. It used to be more in vogue. These are students who are academically inclined, but not necessarily the 4.9 GPA, the perfect 1600 SAT score, the 36 ACT score. These are students who get good grades. They're motivated academically. They take rigorous courses, honors and AP classes. They care about their SAT and their ACT score, but they're not necessarily the valedictorian per se. There are plenty who are, but it's not, you don't have to be considered a good ROTC candidate. It's typically students who like STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, because a lot of the military is STEM focused as opposed to philosophy and history and some of the softer sciences. Although my three sons out of four who are in the programs right now are decidedly not STEM, so it is possible for people who
mhm,
are not particularly STEM focused to have a good engagement there as well. They're typically students who are athletically inclined. They play sports, whether it's varsity, competitive, recreational, club. They enjoy athleticism. They enjoy taking on leadership roles. Maybe that's on a team or a school club or a faith organization, something along those lines. They're also interested in serving their country and their fellow citizens. That's a big component in when you think about service academy or the military service. Service happens to be the word that pops up in there a lot. And Tyler, they're typically not afraid to get their hands dirty. They don't shy away from adventure.
mhm,
And we could talk about the continuum of adventure that may or may not be part of their military experience. But they are eager, I would say, to test themselves in a very unique and unconventional and challenging environment, which is what the military is, at least for a couple of years,
mhm,
to kickstart their career and their life, if you will. And of course, I would say students who appreciate the financial benefits, excuse me, which can be
mhm,
significant, or students who don't have a choice but to earn a sizable scholarship if they want to go to some of the more selective and thus more expensive colleges out there. It may be their only option.
mhm,
And then lastly, I think it's a great opportunity for students out there who have all of these traits, but they really have no idea what they want to do. They know they're capable, they know
mhm,
they're talented, they're eager, they're motivated, they want to do right, but they don't really have a set path in mind. And I say instead of
mhm,
floating around waiting for inspiration to strike at a generic college, taking generic classes in a generic major and spending $70,000 to $100,000 a year, for the pleasure, why not at least entertain or consider an ROTC experience as a more compelling path?
Right, and that's I think it's actually a really interesting option, right? Because at least my friend who did it in college, he did it basically while he was getting his 4-year degree, right? So it's almost like a scholarship that you can earn by kind of like doing, and excuse me if this is maybe a bad way of characterizing it, like a part-time job while you're on campus. Do you feel like that's a fair characterization and kind of an understanding of like the expectations of the role?
I think it is. I often say that because I work with students, not exclusively, but I work with a lot of students both on the highly selective schools and athletes, and then people most recently, the last couple of years, who are really interested in the service component, whether it's service academies or ROTC. And I characterize it just as you did. I tell them there are a lot of students who say, well, should I go to West Point or should I do Army ROTC, which would be the equivalent? One
Hmm.
would be a service academy, West Point. That would be the full-time job, the total immersion. You wear a uniform every day.
Hmm.
You're marching, you're chopping, you're saluting. It's yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. It's very regulated, it's very regimented, it's disciplined. And some people love that. Some people are really into that and they want that
Hmm.
type of structure. On the other hand, if you did Army ROTC, I recently worked with a girl who actually had the choice to do West Point or Duke Army ROTC. She decided that she didn't want
Hmm.
the total immersion. She wanted to do, as you suggested, a part-time military experience at Duke in the Army ROTC unit. And they actually both, at the end of their 4 years, they both graduate with the exact same rank, meaning the person who goes to
Hmm.
West Point doesn't necessarily get extra credit because they went through the grind, the shared suffering, the uniforms, the discipline, the altered social experience. They both graduate as second lieutenants, and they're both move into the ranks of being Army officers. And now some people would argue back and forth that the West Point graduate might have a little bit of an edge because they get a little bit of reputational plus because they went to West Point, which is considered more hardcore. But not everybody
Hmm.
wants that experience. I have sons who are Navy ROTC at Yale. I have another son who's at the Naval Academy, and they have wildly different experiences. They will both end up, when they graduate, at the same rank or the same position once they get into their actual jobs.
Right. Well, and that's kind of the next place I wanted to go, right? So, I mean, it sounds like, the primary group of people that do ROTC are people who want to end up in the military afterwards. Is that roughly correct?
I'm not sure. I mean, I would say anecdotally, I would actually say it's probably, this is completely made up number, but maybe 60-40,
Hmm.
60% of the people don't necessarily see themselves as career military people, but they want to kickstart their life
Hmm.
somehow. And they feel like by getting a leg up, by not having $100,000 in school debt when they graduate, but instead having $150,000 in cash in the bank, not only from not accruing that college debt, but also that guaranteed job that you have after graduating for 5 years. Most of the people that I talk to,
Hmm.
if they're pretty diligent about saving money during those 5 years of that quote unquote mandatory commitment, they end up finishing their fifth year if they decide to separate from the military or to get out of the military and to go back into the civilian world. They typically will have between 100 and $150,000 in the bank to then proceed with the
Hmm.
rest of their life, to go to business school, to go to law school, to buy a franchise, to put a down payment on their house, to invest in a startup, to become an investor, whatever it might
Hmm.
be. So I think some people are looking at this and saying, again, I'm making up the numbers. Maybe 60% of the people are saying, let me look at this as an option. If I do ROTC or the Service Academy and I get a great education for free or near free, and then I get some experience
Hmm.
in the military as a leader of men and women, and I'm traveling the world. I'm getting international experience and world-class leadership training. I'm getting paid the whole time. You actually get paid while you're in
Hmm.
college in addition to the scholarship. If I like it, great. That's an option for me. Maybe I'll make a 20-year career. Maybe I'll make a 30-year career out of it. But if it's not something that I love or I enjoy, or I just see other opportunities elsewhere. I'm still in my mid 20s. I have great leadership experience. I have a great resume. I've led people in various environments, in very trying environments, and I have a head of steam financially that I otherwise wouldn't if I went probably to a normal school with the expenses that we can talk about how expensive things are these days. So some people I think go in there
hmm
like going like gangbusters. I want to be a general. I want to be a general officer. I want to be an admiral, and that's a great path as well. But I think a lot of people are looking at the landscape these days like, wow, the choices in paying for college these days is essentially $50,000 a year, and I'm generalizing here, but
hmm
$50,000 a year to go to an in-state school, which of which there are many of them,
hmm
but that's still a lot of money. This is with no financial aid, or close to $100,000 all in if I go to a private liberal arts school, or I'm an out-of-state student who goes to a state school in the state that I don't live in. That's $50,000 times four, or $100,000 times four. Again, this is assuming that there's no need-based financial aid or other scholarships of any kind. That's a really big
hmm
life-altering, possibly generational changing decision. So that's why I started ServeWell Academy, because I have so many people coming to me and saying, we can't do this anymore. I can't in good conscience commit to $80,000, $90,000 a year to go to a, let's call it just a generic college, to
hmm
when I'm not sure what the payback's going to be. I don't want my son or daughter, and if I'm a student, I don't want to have $100,000 in student loan debt hanging over my head. And if I get a liberal arts degree in philosophy or history or English or something like that, where it's not necessarily a professional degree in engineering or some kind of a STEM degree, chemistry, computer science, those typically will demand more money in the private sector. If you come out with a liberal arts degree from a school and you have $150,000 in debt and you're trying to figure out how you're going to climb out of that, a lot of people are hitting the pause button and they're saying, wait a second, time out. What is ROTC again? I mean, literally, my sons,
hmm
Tyler, will have saved our family, I would say, $1 million in expenses. I have two sons who go to
Yeah.
Yale on Navy ROTC scholarships. So the Navy pool pays for their tuition, which is $70,000 a year, times two students. I have twins,
hmm
times 4 years. That's
hmm
$600,000. And then I have another son who's at
Yep.
the Naval Academy who has a four or $500,000 education for free. That would be coming out of their pockets and my pocket. So when you add those up,
hmm
that's almost $1 million. That's life-changing money for them to be able to graduate debt-free and move on with their lives. So I guess that's a roundabout way of answering your question, which is I would not necessarily say that people should consider service academies and ROTC opportunities if they know that they're dead set on being a military officer or a career military officer. If they're looking for a way to kickstart their
hmm
life and they're nervous about, they're not really sure what they want to do. They're not sure if they want to go toward a professional degree that's going to have a high money ROI when they graduate. They're interested in a life of adventure. They're interested in getting paid to go to school and to get their hands dirty and to figure out some of these leadership lessons of life. I'm getting inundated with people because that math is getting a lot more clear.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's also, I think more people are pursuing scholarships now in general because of the cost of college has gotten so high. But the thing that intrigued me about what you were talking about just now is it sounds like ROTC is a substantial scholarship, like almost equivalent to a full ride in a lot of instances. Is that accurate?
That is accurate to a degree. There's a range like anything else. There's a range. Let me give you the two extremes. One extreme is
hmm
what my sons are experiencing, as I said. So they got what's called a National Navy ROTC scholarship. That means that the Navy will pay their full tuition. So typically, probably most of the audience knows there's two components to college expenses. There is the room and board, which is let's say
hmm
$15,000 a year, maybe $20,000 a year.
hmm
And then there's the tuition. The tuition can be 50, 60, 70, $80,000. That's like the nebulous just a fee to go to college as opposed to your dorm and the meal plan and that type of thing. So in my son's cases, and if
Hmm.
you get a national Navy ROTC scholarship, they're paying the $70,000 bill for each of my sons per year. I mean, I literally get the bill, and
Right.
it says Yale tuition year one, $75,000. Then right below it, Navy ROTC scholarship, $75,000, net zero cost. So there is a
Right.
room and board component. So maybe there's $10,000, $12,000 depending on their room plan and their meal plan and stuff. But we would pay that amount of money if they lived with us or they went to any college. So the other extreme, however, just to show you that I don't want to paint too rosy a picture, meaning every student who does ROTC is
Hmm.
essentially on a full ride. So that I would say that's a little bit of an overstatement. Um, the other extreme would be, let's say, Air Force ROTC. They have different varying levels of scholarship. So you could get a 2-year Air Force ROTC scholarship with a maximum payment of $18,000 a year. So you multiply that by 2 years,
Hmm.
you would be getting a scholarship of $36,000 from the Air Force to participate in 2 years of Air Force ROTC. So that gives you the range. It could go for
Hmm.
anywhere from $300,000 if you're on a full National Navy ROTC scholarship at an expensive college, or it could be maxed out at
Hmm.
$18,000 at only 2 years instead of 4 years. And then the Army, Navy, and Air Force, those are the three different branches that offer ROTC scholarships. There's a wide range of offerings among those different branches. Some could be 2 years, some could be 3 years, some could be full tuition, some could be half tuition, some go back and forth between tuition and room and board. So probably the average would be somewhere in between the very good deal that the Navy ROTC national scholarship recipients get, and then the people who end
Hmm.
up not even getting into the ROTC program until they're a year or two into college. You don't necessarily have to start
Hmm.
ROTC directly as a freshman in college. You can grow into it by going into the unit and participating in the activities, not on scholarship. And then if you like it, you can kick the tires and test drive it, and then you could potentially try to get a scholarship for years 2, 3, and 4, or years 3 and 4, for example.
Got it. Okay. And so, I mean, it sounds to me like, at a minimum, you're kind of looking at 18 grand over the course of your college career, or, some subset of that if you do it for less than 4 years. And then, at most, it can be a full ride. And you also talked about how you get paid while you're in ROTC. Like, how much is that coming out to be?
Yeah, that is not all that much. It's a couple of $100s,
Yeah.
and some of that goes toward the way that they couch it. Some of it goes toward. You also get a book stipend. I think it's $1,200 for a book stipend, but the actual salary that you get, some of that money gets siphoned away immediately toward some of your um, not books per se, but some of the services that you get as part of the ROTC service, ROTC program. So I would say, I think from my son's experiences, they maybe had a few $100s left at the end of each month. So this isn't something where you're getting paid full like a full-time job. It's basically like walk around money for
Mhm.
for food and extra things and travel on the weekends. So it's a couple $100s. It's not thousands of dollars. You're not getting paid as if you're working for the military
Right.
while you're also getting your education. But the two other things that I would note in terms of what the payback is like or what the ROI could be like, we talked about the scholarship itself and how that varies from extremely lucrative and valuable to maybe not as much if you're just doing it for a couple of years, depending on the branch. And then you just mentioned you also get paid during that time, and the payments go up. I think it's something like $350 to $400 your first year, and it ramps up to maybe $700 or $800 a month when you become a fourth year student, ROTC student, or Service Academy student. The other thing, Tyler, that I want to mention, it's not money in your pocket per se in terms of when you're going to college, but the fact that you have a guaranteed job waiting for you where you're making probably
Hmm.
$80,000 a year times 5 years. That's not part of the scholarship per se in terms of how much money you get paid for college or how much money you get paid as a stipend per month, whether it's a book stipend or just your walking around money. But the fact that you know that you're going to be gainfully employed for 5 years or
Hmm.
more at $80,000, and a lot of times, as I mentioned earlier, when you're a junior officer, you're working hard, you're deployed, you don't have a lot of time to do a lot of things to spend the money. So that's why a lot of these junior officers, they have a place to live, so they're not paying for housing. They get fed. They're busy managing all of the people who they're in charge of. They're traveling overseas. They're getting paid $70,000, $80,000 a year, and they don't have a lot of expenses. So if you're disciplined and you put that money away and you get that money working for you, that's another part of the scholarship that has a long tail to it. In other words, even if you're an Air
Mhm.
Force ROTC student and you only wind up getting a scholarship in your junior and senior year, and you only get maxed out at $18,000 a year, but then you go to become an Air Force officer, a commissioned officer in the Air Force for
Mhm.
5 years, that gives you another leg up in terms of your money-making potential. And then the last piece of this, Tyler, is usually when you go to these academies, you're being trained in a STEM field, science, technology, engineering, and math, which is engineering and operations and computer science, aeronautics. Those are very valuable transferable degrees once you get out. So let's say, for example, you work for 5 years and you say to yourself, I had a great experience. I really love the people here, but I don't see myself putting 20
Mhm.
years in the military. I want to get out and go into the civilian world. People who are junior officers with that much experience, who've been out and been leading, they're making 150 or $200,000 right off the bat, typically because they have these very STEM related majors that they can immediately put to work
Mhm.
for Amazon, for Google, for Northrop Grumman, whatever the case may be. So there's a long
Mhm.
shadow that this ROTC scholarship or the Service Academy appointment, there's a long shadow that it casts in terms of getting students well on their way, not only on the leadership side and personal maturity side and personal development side, but on the financial side.
Right. Well, and so I mean it's clear that there's a lot of benefits to it, right? You get a lot of financial benefit, and I think like you said, you kind of almost have your first job out of college built in, which is not a small feat. I'm curious what the commitment is, right? Like what is the commitment for someone that's attending a 4-year college, as opposed to like somebody who's in one of the academies, where I assume that they basically attend that academy like a college. That's kind of your whole life. But like if you're doing ROTC while you're at another school, what is sort of the time commitment for that? And then what other commitments are there maybe after college that you have like to fulfill after that, after you're done with school?
Yeah, if you're in a military, if you're in an ROTC unit at a traditional college, let's call it Duke, and you're going to have a few extra military related classes that you would take over and above what your average college student would take. You might take naval history, you might take a computer science class or a cyber class or something that's related to the military. That's what the ROTC unit is for on campus, is to have a couple of instructors there who are going to instruct you in military specific classes. So it's an extra
Hmm.
class if that's that academically that a normal non-ROTC student wouldn't have to take. They also have
Hmm.
to take a leadership, they call it leadership lab. So they might have a leadership lab every other week, maybe it's every other Friday, where they get together as a group, as an ROTC unit, and they go through leadership, role playing, scenario based training. So they're training to become military officers. So they'll get together periodically and they'll have one off military leadership training. They'll do drills periodically, which might mean learning how to march, learning how to get into formation, shooting, obstacle courses, basically things that a commissioned officer in the military needs to be aware of. I mean, they don't go crazy
Hmm.
with it. They don't have to be in super orchestrated drill formations and doing rifle work and things like that. But they have to understand what enlisted people are up against and some of the traditions and the unique parts of the military. They will train with that periodically. They normally do PT or physical training. They exercise together a
Hmm.
couple times a week. That's normally in the morning. So a typical college
Yeah,
student, sometimes
early
they,
in the morning, I remember.
yeah, probably early in the morning, a typical college student is not only probably not exercising unless they're an athlete, but they're often sleeping through classes because they're on their own schedule. But if you're an ROTC student, it will vary by branch and it will vary by the culture of the ROTC unit that you're in your particular college. Some
Hmm.
of them are really hardcore and they'll work out 3 or 4 days a week at 6:30 in the morning. Some of them are a little bit less intense about it. Maybe they work out 2 or 3 times a week. Sometimes if you're an athlete or you're doing intramurals, you might get a pass and not have to do the early morning workouts with the group. So that's a moving target, but there is definitely a PT, a physical training component. You have to pass a physical training test. There's a minimum amount of push-ups and 1 mile run and sit-ups, things of that nature that you have to. So physically, you have to keep up to speed, and you have to periodically
Hmm.
go out and work out with the group. There might be a monthly training exercise on the weekend, a field training exercise. So maybe once a month, you're going to expose yourself to an aviation wing on a local base. There may be a month that you learn how to do land navigation out in the woods with an overnight, something like that. Again, slowly bringing you up to speed on some of the things that you're going to be facing in your particular branch. You have to wear a uniform periodically. It's not every day,
Hmm.
Tyler, like you would at the service academies, like at the Naval Academy, where you're typically in some kind of a uniform. Even a workout uniform is regulation uniform. But if you're an ROTC student, you might wear that uniform to that extra military class. You might wear the uniform to your leadership lab, but probably 80% of the time, you're wearing flip-flops, you're wearing khaki shorts, you're wearing Birkenstocks, and you're cruising around, and nobody even knows you're an ROTC student. You're just moving about your
Right.
day, and unless somebody saw you in uniform walking to a particular class or doing some training in the on the parkade or something, they may not know that you're in ROTC at all. And in terms of, one
Yeah, I
maybe
mean,
one
I was gonna say that like my friend in college who did ROTC, it really didn't come up very often. So yeah, I was just corroborating what you just said.
yeah, you can make it as yeah, I mean, you can be as high profile or low profile ROTC person as you like. You can get involved in all the ROTC activities and really make a big presence there. Or you can, I don't want to just say be a great person, but you don't have to make a super big deal out of it. The other thing that maybe would
Right.
resonate with the audience in terms of the commitment level is let's compare it to a Division I athlete. So, for example, one of my sons rose crew at Yale, and I asked him, what's the difference in commitment level of a Division I athlete in college versus an ROTC candidate in college? He said it was probably about 30% of what a devoted, committed Division I athlete would have to commit um, in their activities. In other words, the Division I
Okay.
athlete has a lot more commitment. They're doing training tables. They're working out 2, 3, 4 times a day. They're going on trips during the season. They have off-season work. They're doing film work. I mean, they're all in. It's a total immersive experience as a Division I athlete. On the ROTC side, maybe
Hmm.
30 or 40% of that is your time commitment to the ROTC unit. And of course, that will vary too. You could get very committed and want to move up the ranks and be a leader of this ROTC blood drive and be, really want to be in charge of things as you move up. So you can get as involved as you want, or you can do the bare minimum and probably not that as involved. But if you're an ROTC student, you could still be in a fraternity. You can be in a sorority. In fact, they encourage you the ROTC unit encourages you to go out and get involved in the community, join clubs, lead clubs,
Hmm.
invent clubs, get involved on campus and the campus community, and make a mark and make a good name for the ROTC unit because they want you to get leadership experience. And as an ROTC student,
Hmm.
you have somewhat limited opportunities to get together with your ROTC unit because as I said, there's not that many mandatory events. So they want you to try to become the president of the speech and debate club. They want you to get involved in the recycling club or get involved in these other
Hmm.
traditional college campus activities and clubs because they want you to flex your leadership muscles as opposed to the service academies where nearly every single step of the way you're constantly upping your leadership game because your job in the service academies is to lead the more junior classes. So you have a lot of leadership
Hmm.
opportunities and a lot of leadership repetitions to get in the service academies, less so as an ROTC student because most of the time you're just an average student.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think then my sort of follow-up question to this or corollary is, you know, and this is just me playing like sort of cynical podcast host for a second. What's to stop somebody from being basically doing ROTC while in college and then not having a military career afterwards? And basically for, 30% of a D1 athlete's commitment, which call it, I don't know, 10 hours a week, whatever the commitment may be, getting a free education. Like, what is that something that you can do, and it just doesn't happen very often because you kind of get the camaraderie of the program convinces you to stay, or is it something that's relatively frequent and the Army kind of and the other military branches kind of consider it a sunk cost, cost of doing business, or is yeah, just curious, kind of like if you were to approach this as cynically as you could as a student and say, I just want to use this for the money, what's the deal with that and how does that work?
Well, are you suggesting that they do ROTC but then somehow don't do the commitment after, or they specifically do it and they're like, no, I'll do my service commitment for 5 years after, but then I'm definitely leaving the military. Which one are you referring
Yeah,
to?
and more the latter, right? Not trying to get out of the commitment, because obviously, I think that you would get your money taken away if you did
Right.
that.
Yeah.
But
Exactly.
yeah, I think that's more what I was getting at, I guess, is just like,
Gotcha.
do you feel like there's a reasonable population of people that do this, that, their dream is not to be in the military, but this is essentially a tool to get them a college education, with a strong scholarship.
Well, I think yes, I think it's beyond that though. It's not just the scholarship, it's all the experience afterwards of working
Right.
for 5 years. So you're not getting the scholarship and then just bailing out and going to the private sector with a free education. You're actually working. You're a functioning member of the U.S. military as an officer for 5 years, which the Navy and the Army and the Air Force need. They need officers, and ROTC is the biggest
Hmm.
source for those officers. But I understand what you're getting at, and let me suggest this.
Hmm.
For one, they do give you the option, just to show you how interested they are in getting ROTC students. You can drop the ROTC scholarship after year one. So you can go on an ROTC scholarship your freshman year and decide that you don't really like it. And they'll pay for your first year, again,
Hmm.
depending on what the arrangement is with the branch and what type of scholarship it is. But you can drop ROTC after your freshman year if you decide it's not for you. And they're okay with that. They want highly qualified candidates in the pipeline. They don't want to scare people off. They don't really expect a 17-year-old who's thinking about ROTC or the service academies and they're scared and they're intimidated and their parents are in their ear saying, are you sure you want to do the military? So their calculus is,
Right.
we'll give people an option to come in for a year, kick the tires, see if they like it or they don't like it. If they don't like it, no harm, no foul. We got a shot at a highly educated, smart, athletic, well-rounded, academically motivated person. We brought them into the mix, and as you said, maybe they go in there and in year one they're like, "Wow, I thought I was going to do this for the money. I really love what I see. I love the camaraderie. I didn't realize what
Hmm.
what everything they had to offer." So they wind up staying for the 4 years and then working their 5 year commitment. And if they don't want to do it after a year, then they decide to go away. Then the military says, "Hey, we that's a sunk cost. We paid for their first year of college, and they decided it wasn't for them. We don't want to hold on to them kicking and screaming." And I think in the other case, which
Yeah.
is they work for 5 years as a military officer, knowing or thinking that they're not going to spend their entire life in the military. The military needs young gung ho people who are going to fill the ranks because they have people who are retiring every year. They need to fill those shoes. And of course, the military is a hierarchy.
Hmm.
So if everybody who was a junior officer decided they wanted to make it a career, they wouldn't be able to because the hierarchy is a pyramid. And there has to be some fall off
Hmm.
from the junior officers. Not everybody can a go from a lieutenant to a lieutenant commander to a commander and move up the ranks. There has to be some attrition, so there's some natural attrition. They
Hmm.
know that some people are going into this knowing that in exactly 5 years they're going to be five and done, and no harm, no foul. They got
They
great
did
work
their
out of
five,
them.
yeah.
What's that?
Oh, they did their 5 years,
Right,
so yeah,
right.
like no harm, no foul, like you said.
Yeah, they did their 5 years. They went overseas. They put themselves in a position to help the country, and everyone's better after that. And then there are some people, as you suggested, that they do it for 5 years and like, wait a second, this has just begun. I really like what I'm seeing here. I'm moving up the ranks. I'm a golden child. I'm going to move up. I'm going to promote. I'm going to do 20 years, and then I'm going to have a whole nother career after that. And I'll get a pension, and I'll have
Mhm.
all these other benefits. So I think it's a mixture of those things that they want to get highly qualified people in to give them a shot. They want to expose them to the military, knowing that they want some people to attrite, and knowing that some of the people who are left behind are still going to be really highly qualified candidates.
Yeah. Well, and this kind of then leads me to my last question, which is, probably what, like, because you mentioned it, right? People who are maybe new recruits are nervous, right? Parents are kind of nervous. I remember, for a hot second when I was 18, I even was like, I wonder if I should do something in the military branches, and my mom freaked out at me, right? It shows, different upbringings for sure.
Yeah.
But I think the question is sort of what like the short version of the question is kind of, is ROTC safe? Which I know is not totally fair, because yes, of course the program is safe. You're at Yale, right? Like that, it's more like the 5 years afterwards, which you don't really like. It's 5 years in the military. You could be anywhere, right? But just in general, when you get asked that question, like, is this sort of a safe option for my son or daughter? How do you answer that, or how do you address that concern?
I think it is on people's minds. It's on my mind. It's on my wife's mind. I have three people, three sons, and a fourth one coming through the ranks who are doing this. So it makes definitely gets our attention. So I would say this: it's as safe as your son or daughter wants it to be. Only for
Hmm.
one, we'll just talk about some statistics. 40% of military personnel never even get deployed. And it's when you get
Right.
deployed is when you're potentially maybe in a combat zone or something. So 40% of the people don't even get deployed. Of the 60% of the people who do get deployed, less than 10% would ever even be remotely near a combat zone. In other words,
Right.
there's a lot of positions, even for military officers, and maybe especially for military officers who have managerial and leadership roles, where they're not going to be on the front lines. So if your son or daughter
Yeah.
specifically doesn't want, no, because I know what you're saying, Tyler. Some people here, and I battle with
Hmm.
it all the time with perceptions. I talk, especially moms, and immediately when they hear military, they think of the visions of the military walking down the streets of Fallujah, and there's
Hmm.
explosive devices everywhere you turn, and one false move, and it's over. That, generally
Hmm.
speaking, is not the case. Now, I don't want to say that it doesn't happen. I'm just saying it's typically in the it's for your son or daughter to decide for themselves. So if they decide they want to do the Marines, if they decide they want to be SEALs, if they decide they want to do EOD, explosive ordnance disposal, or they want to be in the Army infantry, then yes, I wouldn't say there's a good chance they're going to be in a combat zone, but there's certainly a chance they're actually raising their hand and saying, I want to put myself out there. I know that I know that there's a likelihood that I will go to a combat zone, depending on the op tempo, depending on
Yeah.
what's happening in the world. So all of those things are question marks about what's the mission these days, and are we forward facing? Are we backing off? You have to assume that it's going to be the worst. So if you're going into the SEALs and you're going into the Marines, Army Infantry, EOD, and I was a parent, then I would definitely be a little bit nervous for their safety. However, that's a very, very vanishingly small percentage of people. So if you're a parent and your son or daughter is not into that, I would say that they could rest assured that if they didn't want to be in a combat zone, they could, as an officer, they could pretty well find their way to a non-combat deployment where they're in charge of a medical unit. They're leading a different a
Hmm.
cyber command. They're in charge of drone usage. There's a very, very small percentage of people who are actually in a combat zone, and an even smaller of officers. In the SEAL teams, only 10% of the people in the SEAL teams are officers. Of a 16-person
Hmm.
platoon, there's two officers. So when you add up how many actual officers are strewn around the world in harm's way, for the SEALs, who that's their job, is to go into harm's way, it's still a small percentage. Let alone the Air Force. let alone the
Hmm.
the Merchant Marines, the Coast Guard. Yeah, I mean, those are places where I don't want to say this in a derogatory way. There are definitely places to hide, quote unquote, from the hardcore combat. There are also places to raise your hand and volunteer for
Yeah.
that.
Well, and I was also even thinking, I mean, you talked about like being a medic, but for me, I was even thinking if you're into STEM, there's probably a lot of like mechanical engineering, like, fixing stuff on the boat or fixing stuff on the airplane type of roles. And just like there's a lot of, I don't know if this is the right way to put it, but like a lot of back office work that needs to be done.
Oh, absolutely.
So you,
Support,
like you said,
support.
if you can choose and you have the freedom to choose, which it sounds like you do, um, then you can angle yourself towards that.
Absolutely. There's support, there's logistics, there's medical, there's equipment, maintenance. I mean, all of these units need officers to look after the enlisted people who you usually do a lot of the wrenching and the torquing and the hands-on stuff. There needs to be people in all. I mean, it's a huge bureaucracy, a huge administrative bureaucracy. The military is. They need military
Hmm.
officers to lead that group. So to think that some of the visions that you have on TV of some of these crazy scenarios that are in movies and things, that is such a small percentage of what actually happens that um, you really have to want to be in those positions to get into those positions.
Yep. Great. Well, as we wrap up here, do you kind of have any parting thoughts or kind of things you want to wrap up on related to ROTC scholarships?
Well, the only thing that I would say in closing is because people might be saying, well, how hard is it to get an ROTC scholarship? Are these things just dropping off trees?
Oh,
And
right.
what is the type, what is the likelihood that my son or daughter could get an ROTC scholarship? That's contrasted with a service academy appointment, which is a whole nother ball of wax. You need a congressional nomination. There's interviews. There's a whole bunch of things there. On the ROTC side, I wouldn't say that it's easier per se, because they're definitely looking for high academic athletes, leaders, high character, all those things, people who can articulate, people who can communicate well in groups. But I guess benefit number one is there's not that many people who know about ROTC scholarships, and there are a lot of them out there. I don't know that they
Hmm.
publicly will disclose actually how many. I think every branch has their own. It's a moving target, but put it this way: there's more than 10,000 ROTC scholarships a year, and there's certainly not
Hmm.
that many service academy appointments. So let's call it 10 to 15,000
Right.
ROTC scholarships a year. That's a lot of scholarships nationally, and not that many people know about it.
Hmm.
This is how we kicked off the podcast, which is, what is ROTC? So in some cases, that's good because it limits the competition to get one of these scholarships. On the other hand, for the people who are in the know, the people that I work with privately who are part of ServeWell Academy, and I tell them exactly what to do to make themselves well positioned to get an ROTC scholarship. They typically get one. So it's competitive for the people who are going for it. So in other words, there's not a lot of just
Hmm.
casual people applying for ROTC scholarships because it takes a bit of effort. You have to do an interview. You have to do a physical fitness test. You have to get a medical.
Hmm.
You have to, there's some hurdles to get over. So your casual person who's just window shopping is not going to go through that trouble. So even though fewer people know
Right.
about it, the competition is less. The people who actually go for it are relatively motivated and very, very capable in their own right. The other reason that it's,
Hmm.
I think, well within hand is because you don't have to be a genius. You have to be that old school, well-rounded person, that student. And I talk to parents about this all the time, and they say to me, because I work with a lot of people who want to go to Ivy League schools and highly selective schools, and I talk to them frankly about what their options are to get into Princeton or Stanford or UC Berkeley in these schools. And I say, I'm not sure that Johnny or Jill are really going to have that great a chance to get in. And they say, I can't believe this. They're a 4.5 student. They got a 1500 on the SAT. They're in 3 clubs. They're a 2 sport athlete. And I say, yeah, I get that. They're unbelievable students. But if you saw the types of students that the MITs of the world and the Yales of the world, they're not really looking for well-rounded students like your son or daughter who is absolutely a rock star. They're looking for, instead of well-rounded students, they're looking to craft a well-rounded class of absolute world-class experts in a single dimension. The best cello player in the world,
Hmm.
the number one debater in the world. So if your child is not one of those things, they're not really interested. However, on the ROTC side, they're seeking out that all-American student who can basically do it all. They're in a church group. They play on two sports. They volunteer at the soup kitchen. They have great grades. They care about their SAT. They're doing all these things. There's a place for them in ROTC because you don't have to be an 11 out of 10 in every single thing you do. You have to be an 8.5 out of 10 in a lot of different things. And the population that I work with, there's a lot of kids who are 8.5 and 9s out of 10s who are not going to get into the most selective colleges, but they might get into a school that they wouldn't otherwise get into with an ROTC scholarship. Because the ROTC scholarship is
Hmm.
almost like you're a recruited athlete. The schools have to bring in a certain number of ROTC candidates to fill their spots. And the other reason they like this,
Hmm.
Tyler, is because the federal government pays those tuition bills. So, for example, my
Hmm.
sons, Yale likes ROTC students from the Navy because they know they're getting full tuition. They know that the student's not getting, they don't have to pay financial aid because the government is obligated to pay the school the money. So to be an ROTC student
Right.
applying to some schools that you otherwise wouldn't get into is a nice little hook because you don't have to you're fulfilling what we call an institutional need of the school to make sure that they have a vibrant and robust ROTC program. So they're going to look at you in a different light. They're going to put your ROTC application on what I say the small pile. You're not going to be in the huge pile of other people who look just like
Hmm.
you, very capable, very motivated, great grades, great everything. They're going to look at you on the tiny little ROTC pile, which makes life a lot easier. The other thing is that there's lots of choices. In terms of ROTC scholarships, I say that you can choose your own adventure. You don't have to go to MIT on an ROTC scholarship. You don't have to go to the most selective schools. You can if you want. My sons were motivated to go to Yale on an ROTC scholarship. But if that's too intimidating or you don't have the metrics to get into that type of a school, you can go to Texas A&M. You can go to San Jose State. You can go to a school that it's not that it's better or worse, it's just not quite as selective. You don't have to have the SAT scores. You don't have to have a 5 on every AP exam. You can be, as I said, that highly productive, well-rounded student, and you have a lot of choices because there are a lot of these programs. And maybe I should say the Navy has roughly 150 to 200 ROTC programs on campuses around the country. So it's not as if there's a parent out there and they say, hey, I like what I'm hearing about ROTC. Can you use ROTC at any college? No, there's 4,000 colleges. For the Navy, you can use it at, let's call it 150 schools to 200. The Army and the Air Force
Hmm.
have ROTC programs on over 1,000 different colleges. So I guess my point is not only can you choose the branch that you think suits you better. Are you a water person? Probably you want to try the Navy. Are you a land person? Maybe the Army's a good
Hmm.
bet. Are you an air and space person? Maybe the Air Force is a good bet. So not only do you get to choose your interest level and what environment you like to work in, but also on the continuum of colleges, you can calibrate what colleges you apply to based on what your profile is like. Does that make sense?
Yep. Yeah, that all makes sense. Yeah, I think that was a good like way to wrap things up here, and I think we're yeah, you've covered all kinds of aspects of the ROTC program and just in general how you can use these military essentially like academies or programs to help with your education and your career. So thank you very much for the time. I really appreciate it, and you shared a ton of really helpful information here on a topic we've never covered before.
I'm
Yeah,
glad.
thank you very much for coming on the show.
No problem. Thanks for inviting me on.
Great. Well, this has been Shift, a college admissions podcast for a changing world, hosted by Tyler from Achievable with Phil Black from PrepWell Academy. And you can get a free trial of Achievable's ACT course by going to achievable.me and use the code podcast to save 10% if you're interested.